Cloud was born in the mountain village of Nibelheim. His father died when he was young and he was raised by his mother, and at the age of 13, Cloud learned of Sephiroth and his achievements and wanted to become a hero just like him. So Cloud decided that he would set out and join the Shinra military force in an attempt to become a member of Soldier. After joining Shinra, his dreams of ever joining Soldier were sadly cut short, and he would be downgraded to becoming a simple infantryman for the Shinra army. 2 years later, after joining Shinra, while Cloud was on a simple scouting mission with his platoon, it was here that he would encounter the young, soon-to-be first-class soldier Zack Fair, and the two would become best friends, recognizing that the two had so much in common. During a mission to his hometown of Nibelheim, Cloud would witness Sephiroth suffer a psychotic breakdown and would watch as he began killing everyone throughout the town of Nibelheim and would even witness the death of his own mother. Enraged by this, Cloud would chase Sephiroth to the Mako reactor where he would find his friends Tifa and Zack injured by Sephiroth's assault. Picking up Zack's Buster Sword, he would stab Sephiroth in the back, mortally wounding him. However, after attending to his friends, Sephiroth would re-emerge, and as Cloud attempted to re-engage Sephiroth, he would be impaled by Sephiroth's sword. Despite being injured, Cloud would manage to summon the strength to toss Sephiroth over the edge of the platform right into the life stream of the Mako reactor. After being recovered by Dr. Hojo, Cloud and Zack would be experimented on for 4 years until Zack would awaken and would rescue Cloud from his test tube. With Cloud suffering a high level of Mako poisoning, Zack would carry Cloud's vegetated body to the outskirts of Midgard, where the two were intercepted by a large Shinra army military force. Zack laid Cloud's body out of sight while he went off to fight off the entire army, and despite Zack fighting bravely, he was eventually overwhelmed and gunned down. In Zack's last moments, he would give Cloud his Buster Sword moments before dying. Sometime later, Cloud would join the rebel unit named Avalanche, and alongside fellow Avalanche member Barrett Wallace, they would successfully destroy the Midgard Sector 1's Mako reactor. After taking part in a second mission to destroy another Mako reactor, Cloud would be separated from his allies and would fall into the Sector 5's church, and it was there that Cloud would meet for the second time a young flower girl named Aerith, and he would agree to become her bodyguard. After Cloud reunited with his friends, Shinra would drop the Sector 7 plate, crushing the Sector 7 slums, and in the process would kidnap Aerith. Cloud would lead an assault on the Shinra headquarters, and after successfully rescuing Aerith and defeating the new president of Shinra, Rufus, he would escape Midgard, but not before discovering that the legendary soldier Sephiroth had somehow returned. As Cloud and his friends would travel all around the world, they would find themselves traveling to the Temple of the Ancients, and using Aerith's inner power was able to discover what the reincarnated Sephiroth was planning, as well as how to stop him. Aerith decided to head off to the Forgotten Capital alone and began to pray for the Holy, which is the ultimate white magic to defend against a meteor that Sephiroth was planning to use to destroy the world. Cloud arrived just in time to see Aerith finish praying, but was forced to watch as Aerith was stabbed in the back by Sephiroth, killing her. Cloud would carry Aerith's body to a pool of water in the center of the Forgotten Capital, and he laid her body to rest beneath the water. After recovering from a second dose of Mako poisoning, Cloud and his allies would pursue Sephiroth into the depths of the planet, and with the aid of Aerith's spirit, would not only defeat Sephiroth, but would save the Earth from an oncoming meteor. Squall Leonhart was born in the town of Windhill and was the son of Luguna and Rain Lore. However, his mother Rain would die shortly after he was born, and he would be sent off with his stepsister Eleni to live in an orphanage that was owned by Adia Kramer. While at the orphanage, Squall and Eleni would grow very close, with Squall preferring that Eleni was his only friend. However, one day Eleni left the orphanage under mysterious reasons, and Squall was told that she had abandoned him, causing Squall to become emotionally detached from making any friends. At the age of 6, Squall was sent off to the newly built Balam Garden, and at the age of 15 he would begin his training to become a member of Seed. At the age of 17, while training with his fellow trainee Cypher, Squall would suffer an injury which would leave him with a scar across his face, and he would retaliate by delivering Cypher a similar injury, leaving him also with a similar scar. After completing an assignment given to him for Dalet City, Squall and a couple of his fellow trainees were officially promoted to Seed. After his promotion, Squall and his fellow Seeds were contracted to work with Renoa Hartley, the leader of a resistance faction. Over time, Squall and his allies would take part in many important events, including the attempted assassination of Sorceress Adia, would take part in a battle between Balam and Galbada Gardens, and would even travel to the city of Estar and aid the president, who just so happened to be Laguna himself. Eventually, Squall would discover that the Source's idea was being controlled by a powerful entity from another time, and after she was defeated, Renoa was chosen to become this entity's new host. However, Squall would rescue Renoa before this happened. Squall would then reunite with his childhood friend Eleni, who would inform Squall and his allies that the entity that was responsible for all of this was a being named Ultimacia, and the only way to defeat her was to cause a time compression, allowing Squall and his allies to travel to Ultimacia's era to challenge her in person. With the team passing the final trials of Ultimacia's realm, Squall and his allies would challenge Ultimacia, and after a long, hard-fought battle, they would emerge victorious, bringing the universe back into balance. However, as time began to flow back to normal, he was able to send a message to a young Adia Kramer, giving her the concept of garden and seeds, and with this final act, and some help from Renoa, Squall and the gang were able to return to their own time period where they would celebrate their victory together. Well, what's up again, guys? Brian here at 3TR, here to present the first matchup of Season 4 Versus Series. Now, I gotta tell you guys, I am super pumped up for this matchup. I've wanted to do this matchup for years, going all the way back to Season 1. But now, with all this experience doing these matchups, I think I can finally tackle this ultimate dream match of mine, as I will be literally pitting the two characters that, for me, are completely tied for the number 2 spot on my list of all-time favorite Final Fantasy characters of all time, being obviously below Final Fantasy X's Auron, of course, as the false ex-soldier Cloud Strife will go up against the legendary Seed Squall Leonhart in a battle of which I would consider to be between the two most popular main protagonists in what I call the golden age of Final Fantasy. Now, I would like to state right now that we will be using Cloud as he is at the end of the Final Fantasy VII game only, and we will be doing the same thing for Squall at the end of Final Fantasy VIII. Now, despite my personal thoughts, I will be acknowledging some combative elements from the new Dissidia game that just came out yesterday by the time this video is uploaded, and I will be not acknowledging any of their combative feats that have been shown in the Kingdom Hearts franchise. This will be strictly Final Fantasy only. So with that out of the way, let us begin this dream match of mine, as I will start by comparing these two physically. During the time of Final Fantasy VII, Cloud was a 21-year-old human male standing 5'8", and although he officially did not take part in any Shinra Soldier class training, Cloud's own physicality was more than a match for any opponent. Just like Zack Fair, after Cloud was impaled by Sephiroth and exposed to a high level of Mako, he was used as a guinea pig by Dr. Hojo for 4 years and was injected with Genova cells in an attempt to test Dr. Hojo's Genova reunion theory. Thanks to Dr. Hojo's experiments, Cloud was also granted superhuman physical properties, including strength, speed, durability, and reflexes, which would aid him well during the fall of Shinra and against Sephiroth's first resurrection period. However, though Cloud had the physical potential of a member of Soldier, Cloud did suffer from a number of physical defects. Without the proper training, Cloud was unable to physically balance his combative properties, but instead chose to focus on developing his durability and strength, but neglected to really make any improvements on his natural speed and maneuverability, as Zack Fair had done over the course of his career as a member of Soldier, literally turning himself into a human tank. However, these properties would be improved upon in the coming years following Final Fantasy VII, but during these events, Cloud simply allowed his allies to pick up the slack for what he may have lacked in a physical sense. Squall is classified as a 17-year-old human male standing 5'9" and is in good shape. Like a majority of the power duels within the Final Fantasy franchise, during his training to become a member of Seed, Squall put a heavy focus on his physical build to rely on his strength rather than his speed. However, after being injured by his rival Cypher, Squall would decide to readjust his physical focus to balance himself between his speed and his strength to better allow himself to apply extra power blows within the use of his gun blade. In terms of his durability, I would say that due to the fact that he is still really young, Squall is nowhere near his physical prime, and though Squall is certainly tough as a combatant, he is not the type who would last long in a battle of attrition. Okay folks, let's be honest here. When it comes to physicality between these two, Squall has no chance in hell of matching Cloud's physical performance. At the end of the day, as stated earlier, Squall is just a 17-year-old teenager who is nowhere near his physical prime and is still in development. And as statistics would state, a man's physical prime age lies between their either late 20s to early 30s. And while I would also say the same thing for Cloud, with him being 21 himself during the time of Final Fantasy VII in terms of him still being in development, the inclusion of the Jenova cells within Cloud's body alone cranks his physicality so much that it puts him in an exclusive class of physical combatants. Now, Cloud in a physical sense is certainly well above the majority of protagonists throughout the Final Fantasy franchise, but Cloud would easily be classified as the weakest member within this exclusive physical class, and would easily be outperformed by the likes of Sephiroth, Genesis, Angiel, and even Zack. But again, this would still place him well above most of the primary protagonists within the entire Final Fantasy franchise, and there are only a few characters that I can think of that could actually outperform Cloud in a physical sense without the need of physical enhancements like the Jenova cells within Cloud's body. But Squall is not one of them. Overall, Cloud is stronger, faster, has far more stamina, endurance, reflexes, and can take a hell of a lot more punishment than Squall ever could, and for all of these reasons, Cloud gets the unquestionable edge in physical capabilities. For this matchup, Cloud will be wielding the Buster Sword, which was given to him by his best friend Zack Fair when he was killed, and it has been classified as an enormous broadsword. From the tip of the blade to the handle, it is approximately 5 to 6 feet long, with the single-edged large blade approximately being 1 foot wide. There are 2 holes near the handguard, which have been theorized to be either materia slots, or that is simply the clips that Cloud uses to place the sword on his back. Due to the sword's overall design, this weapon was quite heavy and it was designed for power strikes, but thanks to its size, it could also be used very effectively to perform defensive blocks against a variety of different kinds of attacks. A user of this weapon could also use the Buster Sword to perform speed-based attacks. However, I don't believe that during Final Fantasy VII Cloud had ever developed his skills with this weapon to perform such maneuvers, even with his physical enhancements, but instead was exclusive to the weapon's previous owners. The sword itself also contained a unique ability to fire off energy waves at an opponent, however, these waves could be blocked by well-timed deflection. For this matchup, Squall will be bringing his primary weapon that he spent a majority of his Seed training using, and that was the Revolver Gunblade. Now, as the name states, a gunblade is simply a blade that is attached to the handle section of a gun. Now, there have been numerous different variations of Gunblade throughout the Final Fantasy franchise, but the Revolver Gunblade used by Squall was measured at a little over 3 feet long from the handle to the tip of the blade, with the blade itself measuring a little over 2 feet long. The blade itself was very thin, which allowed the weapon to have a solid balance, allowing it to perform both speed and power strikes. However, because of its thinness, the blade could perhaps be broken if enough force struck the weapon. Now, as dumb as many people have claimed that Squall's specific gunblade design has been, the concept of a gunblade is actually pretty ingenious. Just like the curved lightsabers used by Star Wars characters like Count Dooku, the curved handle actually allows the user far better control of the weapon since it fits better into the palm. But the most sophisticated addition to the gunblades of Squall's era was the use of the trigger mechanism. The inclusion of this trigger mechanism would allow Squall to fire a shockwave through the blade itself as he attacked, allowing the weapon to double the amount of force delivered onto an opponent without Squall having to apply too much of his own strength into his blows. Now, this department is a bit odd to call because it really depends on one's viewpoint when deciding which weapon is actually better and more useful in this particular matchup. While I will openly admit that the Gunblade is by far the more technologically advanced weapon, with the addition of the revolver handle which would grant Squall better control of his weapon, and the trigger mechanism which would double his attack output without tiring Squall out, at the end of the day, Cloud's Buster Sword is just the more practical and reliable weapon to use. For starters, it's so much bigger of a sword in both terms of length and thickness of the blade itself. The thickness of the sword itself is incredibly important because it is my belief that if Cloud struck Squall's Gunblade with enough force, he could literally snap that weapon into pieces. The length of the weapon is also important because it gives Cloud far more combative range than Squall's Gunblade would give him. Now, for a regular person like you or me, the revolver handle for the Gunblade would grant us better control of our weapon than trying to wield a 5 to 6 foot long giant sword would be nearly impossible for us normal folks. That wouldn't be the case for Cloud, as his physical enhancements allow him to wield the Buster Sword with excellent control, and if we go back even further into Cloud's past, he was able to handle this weapon and pick it up like it was nothing at the age of 16, well before he was injected with the Genova cells, which leads me to the possibility that the Buster Sword was created with the use of an extremely light but tough durable metal, but this is only a speculation on my part. Now, the trigger mechanism is certainly a very effective addition that any sword-wielding combatant would benefit from using. I just find it very unlikely that even with the inclusion of the extra boost in force, they would have any chance of standing up against the Buster Sword. So while the Gunblade is the far more sophisticated and technological weapon between the two, the Buster Sword is far more down-to-earth and practical weapon between these two. And for this specific matchup, it is for these reasons that I give Cloud's Buster Sword the edge in weapons. Now, before we begin analyzing Cloud and Squall's magical and special abilities, there are a couple of elements about this particular department that I wish to address right now to keep this section as even as possible, and that is the use of summonings and of their limit breaker attacks. Now, obviously, I've never granted permission for any Final Fantasy character to use them, but in this matchup, I do openly acknowledge that the addition of summonings, or guardian forces as they are called in Final Fantasy VIII, are quite important. So for Squall, I will permit him to be able to equip and use their extra functions, but they will not be called upon to help him at any time. And the same goes with Cloud and his summonings, as in order for to use a summoning, he has to have a specific material equipped, which he will not have access to in this matchup. Next is their limit breaker attacks, and again, due to the nature of how limit breaker attacks are actually tied directly to which Gunblade Squall is using, as it was set in Final Fantasy VIII, when compared to Cloud, this would put Squall at a serious disadvantage. So for those of you who do not know, the only Gunblade that allows Squall access to all of his limit breaker attacks is the Leonhart, which he will not have access to in this matchup. So to help him out, I will limit Cloud to having access to only his level 1 limit breaker attacks. So that makes it 2 limit breaker attacks for Cloud and 2 for Squall. So with that out of the way, although Cloud spent most of his time during the events of Final Fantasy VII practically mimicking Zack's sphere of magical abilities, it is clear that Cloud did not elevate this practice to the same degree. Cloud's use of magic was relatively basic, allowing his allies to develop their skills in this department much higher than him. The basic materia that Cloud usually carried on him at all times was his use of fire, ice, and thunder-like magics, just to name a few. And though I believe that by the end of Final Fantasy VII, Cloud would have developed his materia to their maximum levels, his primary use of magic as a combatant was only optional, and was only meant to be used to deal with opponents who chose to keep their distance, much like Zack did. However, with that said, Cloud did have enough time to develop a series of special attacks that were exclusive to him, namely his limit breaker attacks. Limit breakers are specifically enhanced attacks that become accessible once Cloud's battle gauge has filled up to its max over the course of a battle. But by the end of Final Fantasy VII, Cloud had access to 7 limit breaker attacks, but as stated earlier, he will only have access to 2 of them in this matchup. The first was called the Braver attack, which was a single concentrated power strike to deliver a serious amount of damage to an opponent. The second limit breaker attack was called Cross Slash, which allowed Cloud to deliver 3 power slashes at once that not only had the ability to not only paralyze an opponent, but allowed Cloud to deliver up to 3 times the amount of damage that Cloud could dish out with just one of his normal basic attacks. In a whole, Cloud may not be the most sophisticated magic user in his party, but he is certainly bringing the highest concentration of raw destructive power, making Cloud one of the most dangerous protagonists in all of Final Fantasy. Now, the challenge I have when it comes to analyzing Squall in terms of his magical abilities is the fact that there is not many sources that clarify exactly what magical abilities he uses in combat. The very nature of how magic is used in Final Fantasy VIII itself is very unreliable due to the fact that magic is heavily limited with the use of the draw system, which requires a character to draw a quantity of magical spells from an opponent instead of actually learning the spell themselves, meaning that a character is limited to the amount of times a character can use a specific spell only by the amount of times that they have drawn a specific spell from an enemy opponent. Another element of Squall's magic abilities which is also unreliable is the use of his Guardian Forces. The Guardian Forces are the summonings of Final Fantasy VIII, and what makes them so important is that they allow a user to equip a specific Guardian Forces abilities to channel whatever magical abilities they can draw within themselves and transfer that power into their physical status. But again, there is no source that states exactly what Guardian Forces Squall has officially equipped. There are only 2 that we know for a fact that Squall would have been in contact with, and even if he had these 2 equipped on him, he would only have access to very basic fire and ice spells, and though having these 2 Guardian Forces equipped could be applied to his physical properties, it would only affect the battle in a very minimum way. And on top of that, even if he decided to use these Guardian Forces in the middle of the fight, which he won't, that would be a literal death sentence since it requires him to be completely defenseless while he is concentrating on summoning these Guardian Forces. The only reliable special attack that Squall has in his corner is the use of his Limit Breaker attacks. With Squall having his Revolver Gunblade equipped for this matchup, he has access to only 2 of these Limit Breaker attacks. The first is called, and for those of you who are really sensitive on pronunciations, please work with me, I am saying this as it is spelled, going by the name Rizukuken, which was a series of fast, dedicated power strikes that when used alongside the use of the Gunblade's trigger mechanism could deliver from 4 to a maximum of 8 possible strikes. If Squall could perform this special attack perfectly, it would then be followed up by a second Limit Breaker attack called Rogue Divide, which, though remains his weakest of all of his Limit Breaker attacks, allows Squall to charge forward and slash at the immediate opponent, which is then followed up with a diagonal upward cut, causing an explosion that damages all opponents within the area. However, without the use of a powerful spell known as Aura, which I would like to state he will have access to in this matchup, he could only access these special abilities when his health was low. In a whole, Squall may not be the most focused magic user in his party, but within the variety of his special finishing moves, he is packing a lot of raw combative might. This one is the easiest to call. Between these 2, there is no question that not only is Squall more effective as a magic user, but he is far more willing to use them in battle than Cloud. Cloud's entire combative style was copied directly from Zack Fair, and while he himself was a reasonably powerful user of magic, he did not apply it as often as one would expect, choosing to rely on attacking with his sword and only falling back on using his magical abilities when he needed to. Being trained to become a member of Seed taught Squall the importance of applying magical abilities alongside the use of direct physical attacks, and because of this, it made Squall a far more effective and flexible user of the art. His ability to draw magic from his opponents and fire them right back immediately will be an extremely reliable technique that could be used in this engagement, and on top of that, there are even a couple of magical spells that would be extremely useful and exclusive to Squall only. Finally, when it comes to using their Limit Breaker attacks, Cloud is completely outclassed, as Squall's first Limit Breaker attack alone could deliver more hits than both of Cloud's Limit Breaker attacks could deliver combined. And while I don't believe that Squall could deliver as much damage on the level that Cloud would be able to dish out with his Limit Breaker attacks, that doesn't change the fact that Squall could deliver more hits to Cloud and could use both Limit Breakers back to back, which could cause a serious amount of damage to Cloud. Cloud might have a more powerful collection of magical and special abilities at his disposal, but he is not nearly as combatively effective with them to cause any real serious problems to Squall. And while Cloud would certainly be able to recognize a majority of the magical abilities that Squall would throw at him with his experience, there would be a few moments of difficulty when Squall decided to throw out a number of magical abilities that he did not recognize. And for these reasons, I give Squall the edge in magical and special abilities. Just like in all my previous Versus series matchups that I have done over the years involving sword users, I'll be using Star Wars lightsaber fighting forms to help describe and illustrate Cloud and Squall's combative and tactical approaches. So with that out of the way, the interesting challenge that is presented for me when it comes to analyzing these two in this department is the simple fact that as straightforward combatants, Cloud and Squall are completely identical to each other and take the exact same role within their respective parties. They are both represented as the primary direct offensive attacker with their teammates acting as support, with the primary difference between these two units being that Squall and his party members were trained to operate as a collective unit, while Cloud and his allies are a simple collection of various different types of combatants that are all working towards a similar goal, which to me makes Squall and his party the far more overall effective combative unit. As swordsmen, both Cloud and Squall would be practitioners in Forms 1 Sicho and Form 5 Xian, with the use of Form 5 Xian being focused more on the Gemso variation, which was adopted with the Form 2 Makashi properties of being designed for blade-to-blade combat. The primary combative traits of Sicho and Gemso was that Sicho applied wide sweeping strikes designed to strike out against numerous opponents at once, and its unpredictable wide-scale maneuvers could be useful to disarm an opponent. Gemso was a heavy-handed, strength-oriented fighting style designed for blade-to-blade dueling that was built around the tactic of following up defensive maneuvers with immediate offensive counters. The primary weakness of Sicho was that its wide sweeping attacks left many openings that a single opponent could apply precision-based strikes and could exploit them, while Gemso's focus on strength left it very exposed to more speed-based offenses, as its lack of mobility could cause a Gemso user to become overwhelmed. However, both weaknesses can be compensated for to a degree with enough experience and practice. So as direct combatants, what ultimately decides this round is whose training and experience better prepares them for a fight. And when it comes to that, Squall holds a solid advantage over Cloud. Seed training began at age 15, which means that by the time of the events of Final Fantasy VIII, Squall would have taken part in a minimum of 2 years of extreme combat training, and his rivalry with fellow Siege trainee Cypher would have made Squall an exceptionally skilled swordsman. And ironically, Cypher as a swordsman is the complete opposite to Squall, and applies all of the maneuvers and techniques that Squall's forms would have been weak against, which ultimately led to how Squall received his signature scar on his face. But Squall's skill would develop to such a degree that he would eventually surpass Cypher despite being at a disadvantage skill set wise, which to me is a very impressive feat. While Cloud on the other hand did not experience such advantages in his development as a combatant, by the time Zack Fair died and the beginning of the Avalanche mission to attack the Midgar reactor, only 2 months had passed, which gave Cloud a very small amount of time to recover from Dr. Hojo's experiments on him. What's more is that Cloud's skill sets as a combatant were not based upon any kind of practical training, but was more based off of in-the-moment combat experience. It's fair to say that during the mission to destroy the first Mako reactor, that the very first engagement in the game was literally the very first time that Cloud had actually practiced these combative techniques against any type of opponent in the moment, and everything that he had performed from that moment on was based off of memory from what he had seen Zack perform during his time acting as part of a support unit during Zack's missions for Shinra. And while Cloud should be commended, as I certainly believe he developed a solid skill base by the end of Final Fantasy VII, it was mainly based off of only group engagements, and the amount of fights that Cloud would have had as a solo combatant would have been relatively small, which caused Cloud to unknowingly dilute the techniques that he was copying. As members of soldiers were trained to be one-man armies and not operate within a consistent set of backup partners, which to me makes Cloud a slightly weaker version of Zack Fair, as by the time of his death, despite the amazing achievements that Cloud was able to pull off alongside his allies, Zack was simply an overall better fighter. Because of this, Cloud would be at a disadvantage against any properly trained combatant, or against an opponent who could apply maneuvers and techniques that Cloud had no experience against. So with that all said, it is clear that between these two, Squall would have the practical edge in this department, having gone through proper combative training and also having more experience with applying all of his capabilities and not solely rely on using the blade alone. His training to become Seed would have taught Squall the importance to incorporate the use of his magical abilities alongside his swordsmanship, and while Cloud is by no means a pushover with use of his own magical and swordsmanship, he would not be nearly as balanced as Squall would be, and it is for these reasons that I feel comfortable giving Squall the edge in martial skills and as a battle tactician. With this matchup sitting at 2 for 2, the final outcome of this matchup is ultimately decided by a single department, and despite his advantages, when all is said and done, Squall cannot win this fight. He may have the advantage in magical and special abilities, but that edge is more decided with the fact that Squall is more willing to use them in battle than Cloud, not that he's more powerful. And while Squall is certainly a more properly trained combatant between the two, it's the wrong type of training and approach to apply against Cloud. What this all comes down to is physical performance, and as I stated earlier in this video, Squall does not have a chance in hell of matching Cloud in that department. Despite what some of you may believe, there is a point where physical capabilities can override skill, and in this type of engagement, Cloud has certainly exceeded that requirement. Squall may be more willing to use his magical spells against Cloud, but he is bringing almost nothing that Cloud either hasn't already seen before, can't perform himself, or can't power through. The only abilities that Squall would have that would be of any use in this fight would be his Limit Breaker, but due to the insane amount of punishment that Cloud can take, Squall would have to apply both his Limit Breaker sequences perfectly at least 3 or 4 times before Cloud went down, and once Squall has used this once, Cloud is not going to fall for this a second time. Squall may be a more properly trained and skilled combatant, but his entire approach to combat is too direct. Both Cloud and Squall are completely identical in terms of their approaches, so Squall will be initially trying to beat Cloud at his own game, and his physicality cannot compete. Cloud may have simply copied Zack Fair, but he would be copying a combatant who was leaps and bounds ahead of Squall. Their approaches to combat is not about trying to outmaneuver their opponents, it is about going straight at them and overwhelming them with their physical strength. What's more is that Cloud's Buster Sword is a far more reliable in practical sense weapon than Squall's Gunblade, and in this type of battle, once Cloud decides to start cutting loose and going all out, Squall's Gunblade would be quickly destroyed. Now, just to respond to some critics that I'm sure I will be receiving in the comments section, some of you may be saying, wait a damn minute, Brian, are you saying that a badass like Squall would lose, but a wussy boy like Titus would win? And my answer to you is yes. Going back to that matchup, the reason why someone like Titus has a much better chance of defeating Cloud is because though he's not the smartest character, and he's ultimately a one-trick pony, he has literally put all of his combative properties into the one kind of combative approach that Cloud does not know how to effectively deal with, and that is against speed-focused offenses. And despite how dumb Titus is as a character may seem, as a combatant, he is applying one of the most important tactics taken right from the greatest military tactician of all time, Sun Tzu, in which one must avoid what is strong and attack what is weak. And even Titus isn't dumb enough to go head to head with a guy wielding a 5 to 6 foot giant sword, and he would use his speed and athleticism to attack Cloud at his exposed body parts and simply wear him down and make sure to avoid Cloud's power strikes until he went down. However, I would like to point out right now that this weakness is not something that Squall would fall victim to, as his sparring matches against Cypher would prepare him for a more focused speed offensive approach tactician or combatant like Titus, as it has been shown that he can contend with even the likes of Sephiroth for a time, which is something I do not believe Cloud at this point in his life could ever do. Cloud copied his entire approach to combat from Zack, and Zack never lived long enough to find an answer for this weakness. And while Zack did prove that he could hold his own for a time against what I consider to be the greatest swords fighter in Final Fantasy history, who happened to be speed focused, so while anything less than that would be something that Zack could eventually adapt to, Cloud would not be able to pull off this same result. Despite how many feel about Cloud as a combatant, there are 3 types of combatants that can easily take Cloud down. A. Combatants that are physically superior to him. B. Combatants whose strength and will in the power of magic is so immensely powerful that it makes up for their lack of direct physical performance. And C. Combatants whose overall skills level as a combatant completely eclipses Cloud to such a degree that even Cloud's own physical capabilities can't make up for the difference. And just to go into them individually, Sephiroth is the greatest swordsman in all of Final Fantasy and happens to be a speed fencer, which is exactly what Cloud doesn't know how to deal with. Auron is for power duelists what Sephiroth is for speed fencers, which gives him more than 10 to 15 years of combat experience, which would be more than enough to deal with Cloud. And with Zack, if Cloud is simply copying Zack, then obviously Zack's skills level is going to be superior. However, I would like to say that Cloud would improve upon this in Advent Children, but during Final Fantasy VII, that wouldn't happen. And unfortunately, Squall does not fall into any of these classes. The fight between Cloud and Squall would be a pretty straightforward and quick engagement. Squall would make the first move, charging at Cloud, attacking him with his direct power blows, but Cloud, not even using his full strength, would be successful in stonewalling Squall's offensive strikes, even with the extra boost of Squall's revolver's gunblade trigger mechanism, and Cloud would be applying effective defensive blocks, recognizing that Squall is applying a completely identical attack pattern that he himself uses. Squall would then realize that he is having no success at all at applying any serious amounts of pressure to force Cloud back, so Squall jumps back and begins firing a series of magical spells at Cloud. But Cloud, using his basic physical capabilities, is able to run and jump around, dodging all of Squall's spells, and even when Squall begins performing his draw technique to draw magic spells from Cloud's body, Squall quickly realizes that Cloud's materia just gives him all of the magical spells that he already has. Getting frustrated at this point, Squall would then cast his aura spell on himself, which would grant him access to his limit breaker attacks. Now powered up, Squall would use his first limit breaker attack, which, with its enhanced speed properties, is successful in delivering a series of dedicated speed power strikes to Cloud. And then Squall would follow this up with his Rogue Divide attack, with the combination not only causing a good amount of damage to Cloud, but it would knock him back a good distance. Having taken a good amount of damage from Squall's limit breaker sequences, Cloud gets pissed off and decides to go all out with his own offensive approach, with Cloud using his own base form enhanced speed, charges at Squall and attacks him with the full force of his enhanced super strength, which is not only catching Squall completely off guard, but it puts him in a state of shock as he has never experienced such attacks with such magnitude. Squall attempts to increase the distance between himself and Cloud, but Cloud refuses to let up and knocks Squall back with a powerful strike, causing a good amount of damage to Squall. Squall begins to recover, but before he knows it, Cloud is already on him, and with having very little time to react, Squall decides to respond with a final powerful strike of his own, but as his gun blade and Cloud's Buster Sword clash, the blade of Squall's gun blade is cut in half, destroying the weapon, with Cloud stopping his blade just on Squall's shoulder, preventing it from cutting Squall into 2 pieces, despite being pissed off. With his weapon destroyed, his magical spells being useless, and knowing that he cannot match the physical might of Cloud, Squall drops to his knees, acknowledging his defeat. I declare Cloud, the false ex-soldier, the winner. And that will do it for the first matchup of my Season 4 Versus series, and despite this outcome, this did not change my thoughts and feelings between these 2 characters one bit, and they still remain completely even to me as characters in my eyes. But tell me, do you agree that Cloud is simply too physically superior for Squall's skill set to make up the difference, or do you believe that Squall could use his overall combative training and experience to somehow pull off an upset? Share your thoughts and opinions with me and everyone else in the comments down below, and if you enjoyed this matchup, please like and subscribe to keep track of my future Versus Series matchups and other videos, and don't forget to follow me on Twitter and friend me on Facebook with the links down in the description if you want an update on the following matchups. And like always, thank you guys for watching, you're awesome, and there's a quick preview of the next matchup coming out late next month. Please enjoy.